Foreign internal defense is a term used by a number of Western militaries, including the United States, France and the United Kingdom, to describe an approach to combating actual or threatened insurgency in a foreign state called the host nation. The term counter-insurgency is more commonly used worldwide than FID. FID involves military deployment of counter-insurgency specialists. According to the U.S. Doctrinal Manual, Joint Publication 307.1, Foreign Internal Defense, those specialists preferably do not themselves fight the insurgents. Doctrine calls for a close working relationship between the HN government and military with outside military, diplomatic, economic, and other specialists. The most successful FID actions prevent actual violence, although that is rarely possible. When combat is needed, it is best done by HN personnel with appropriate external support. The external support preferably being in a non-combat support and training role alone. Definition. Formally, FID is defined as participation by civilian and military agencies of a government in any of the action programs taken by another government or other designated organization to free and protect its society from subversion, lawlessness, and insurgency. Quote, "It is the main area for United States counterinsurgency doctrine, although other nations, such as France and the United Kingdom, have carried out FID missions." The FM 3-24 counterinsurgency defines counterinsurgency as insurgency and its tactics are as old as warfare itself. Joint doctrine defines an insurgency as an organized movement aimed at the overthrow of a constituted government through the use of subversion and armed conflict. Stated another way, an insurgency is an organized, protracted politico-military struggle designed to weaken the control and legitimacy of an established government occupying power or other political authority while increasing insurgent control. Counterinsurgency is military, paramilitary, political, economic, psychological, and civic actions taken by a government to defeat insurgency. These definitions are a good starting point, but they do not properly highlight a key paradox. Though insurgency and coin are two sides of a phenomenon that has been called revolutionary war or internal war, they are distinctly different types of operations. In addition, insurgency and coin are included within a broad category of conflict known as irregular warfare. In many respects, it is the mirror image of the U.S. doctrine for guerrilla warfare, which in U.S. special operations is called unconventional warfare. Military and paramilitary operations, normally of long duration, predominantly conducted by indigenous or surrogate forces who are organized, trained, equipped, supported, and directed in varying degrees by an external source. It includes guerrilla warfare and other direct offensive, low-visibility, covert, or clandestine operations, as well as the indirect activities of subversion, sabotage, intelligence gathering, and escape and evasion. When American advisors were sent to Laos and South Vietnam in the early 60s, the major problem was not to create guerrilla units, but to fight existing Laotian and Vietnamese guerrilla forces. It seemed logical that soldiers trained to be guerrillas would have a deep understanding of how to fight guerrillas, so Special Forces was given that mission. The White Star mission in Laos was initially covert, and used Special Forces and other personnel under Central Intelligence Agency control. Whether the mission is called counter-guerrilla, counterinsurgency, or foreign internal defense, it involves assisting a friendly government, the foreign in FID, to defend against guerrillas acting inside its borders. FID can also involve training a foreign government to deal with a future internal guerrilla threat. Note well the use of external source above. Foreign internal defense may also involve defense against infiltrators, or even conventional military forces crossing national borders. FID, however, is focused primarily on situations when the major conflicts will take place inside the national borders. Unconventional warfare has historically been used in one of two ways: to support or shape the environment for the larger conventional campaign, such as World War II resistance operations conducted before the Normandy invasion. Unilateral effort, generally conducted covertly, includes Afghanistan against the Soviets in the 1980s, and again in Afghanistan after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Effective FID and partnership. FID exists only within a context of host nation internal defense and development, where it can be a force multiplier for regional commanders concerned with counterinsurgency. Insurgencies today are more likely to be transnational than in the past. Political power is the central issue in insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. Each side aims to get the people to accept its governance or authority as legitimate. Insurgents use all available tools, political, informational, military, and economic, to overthrow the existing authority. This authority may be an established government or an interim governing body. Counterinsurgents, in turn, use all instruments of national power to sustain the established or emerging government and reduce the likelihood of another crisis emerging. It has been a basic axiom that successful FID programs are real partnerships. According to Kordsman, a set of rules for establishing such partnerships include: real security dialogue at the bilateral and regional level means listening and last personal relationships. Security cooperation should focus on security and stability, not political or social reform. Such efforts should recognize the legitimacy of different values and be the subject of a separate dialogue. Build trust by clearly seeking friend or allies' security. Focus on building local self-defense and deterrence capabilities, not presence or dependence. Help friends and allies build forces in their own way, do not mirror image. Recognize the reality that other nations define threats and allies differently from the U.S. Arms sales must clearly benefit the buyer, not just the seller. Ensure sustainability, capability to operate own forces in own way, responsive time-sensitive aid, deployment, sales, and transfers. Especially when the HN government, the insurgency, and the FID force come from different cultures. Careful thought needs to be given both to the way the parties perceive the rules, and the ways they communicate their agreement to one another. Stephen Metz, of the U.S. Army Strategic Studies Institute, observed, after the Second World War, the United States initially framed insurgency in Cold War terms. The most successful insurgencies were ones which became more and more state-like, controlling ever larger swaths of territory and expanding the military capability to the point that they could undertake larger operations. They developed organizational specialization and complexity with separate leaders, combatants, political cadre, auxiliaries, and a mass base. U.S. thinking tended to gravitate to the Maoist insurgent strategy of People's War, which held that the rebels sought the internal formality and differentiation of a state. Insurgency, in other words, began as an asymmetric conflict but became less so as it progressed. The American notion of counterinsurgency rejected the brutal, mailed fist approach used throughout history in favor of methods more amenable to a democracy, derived from British, French, and American experience in small wars. This stressed simultaneous actions to neutralize or destroy insurgent armed formations, separate the insurgents from the people, and undertake political economic reform. The American approach was to support a partner government, strengthening it and encouraging it to reform. Foreign internal defense. U.S. involvement began at a low level, escalated until the partner state could stand on its own and had institutionalized political and economic reform, then receded once the insurgents were defeated and the government controlled its territory. Metz warns that the paradigm may have changed. Insurgency matters today because it is linked to the phenomenon of transnational terrorism. Insurgents have long used terrorism in the operational sense, deterring those who supported the government and creating an environment of violence and insecurity to erode public trust in the regime. But now terrorism plays a strategic role as well. Insurgents can use terrorism as a form of long-range power projection against outsiders who support the government they are fighting. This could deter or even end outside assistance. It is easy to imagine, for instance, that the already fragile backing for American involvement in Iraq would erode even further if the Iraqi insurgents launched attacks in the United States. Even more important, an insurgent movement able to seize control of a state could support transnational terrorists. The idea is that insurgents have demonstrated an affinity for violence and extremism which would favor the policies if they came to power. He rejects the idea that transnational terrorism is uniquely Islamic. It is less the chance of an insurgent victory which creates a friendly environment for transnational terrorism than persistent internal conflict, shattering control and restraint in a state. During an insurgency, both the insurgents and the government focus on each other, necessarily leaving parts of the country with minimal security and control. Transnational terrorists exploit this, and protracted insurgency creates a general disregard for law and order. Organized crime and corruption blossom. Much of the population loses its natural aversion to violence. Thus, a society brutalized and wounded by a protracted insurgency is more likely to spawn a variety of evils, spewing violent individuals into the world long after the conflict ends. Participants in FID programs. No external force can guarantee success against an insurgency unless the people regard the host nation government as legitimate. Limited external support helped Ramon Magsaysay defeat the Hukbalahap insurgency in the Philippines, with one of the most important parts of that support being the availability of air transport so he could be visible in remote areas. The Vietnam War showed that even a superpower cannot make an unresponsive and corrupt government succeed against insurgents, especially when the superpower has significant conflict in its internal decision-making. An ineffective HN government guarantees the failure of counterinsurgency. The first part of this discussion discusses two parts of the McCormick Magic Diamond terms: the counterinsurgency force and the international community and other nation-states. Diplomatic. There will almost always be a variety of other participants, which can include friendly neighbor states, states sharing a coalition, and non-governmental organizations. At the intergovernmental level, the highest decisions will be reached between diplomats at the HN Foreign Ministry or Department of State, with the ambassadors of the nations providing for being key players. The diplomatic level sets the highest policies. States that are generally strong still may need FID assistance for well-defined problems, especially problems where they lack skill and resources that they can, over time, acquire. For example, ASEAN is a Southeast Asian regional alliance including highly competent states such as Singapore. Nevertheless, they may need to develop additional resources ranging from port inspection to sea surveillance to advanced intelligence. Non-governmental organizations. The very conditions that may necessitate a stability operation as support operation, widespread human suffering, population movements, famine, human rights violations, and civil war are also the conditions that attract the services of non-governmental organizations. To work with them effectively, HN and FID personnel need to do understand that each organization or agency has a different mandate, set of capacities, organizational design, and cultural orientation. Some may prefer not to work with military organization. NGOs and PVOs may require services from combat service support units. The assistance may have been negotiated before the organization arrived in the area of operations, or the situation may create a sudden demand. Responsibilities may also include support of coalition members, representatives of non-governmental organizations. For example, recent multinational operations involving U.S. forces have at times included representatives from nations unable to fully support their deployed forces. Calls by coalition members for U.S. support have in other instances been due less to an inability to provide assistance than to a desire to take advantage of superior U.S. capabilities. Urban operations put coalition forces in closer proximity to each other. The number of such requests is therefore likely to be greater during such contingencies. Operational readiness. A coalition politics may dictate that they be granted despite the resultant burden on U.S. CSS units. U.S. Marine Corps forces found themselves providing various types of assistance to members of the media during the 2002 operations in and around Kandahar, Afghanistan. Already tasked with requirements beyond those initially expected, scarce resources were further stretched by having to support 50 members of these various commercial organizations. Military Western Special Operations Forces are considered strategic assets with core missions including FID and UW. They may have other capabilities relevant to specific situations, such as demining. United States Army Special Forces are among the most versatile organizations, but not all the capabilities may be needed for a specific FID situation. For example, the most urgent need might be for public health specialists or airfield construction crews, which operate on a level far beyond the medical or engineering specialists of a U.S. Special Forces unit. Public health or construction organizations, however, have limited and no self-defense capability and will need protection in insecure areas.